All right. Hi, everyone. Starting at the wrong slide here. So here we go. So our last video was on the causes of World War I. That was really a review of the causes from last year that you already learned about, but also then specifically what got the U.S. to join the war, the Lusitania, the Zimmerman telegram, and all those things that really changed public opinion, who was really against joining the war for so long. So we're going to go into some of these things in greater detail later. Women and African Americans in the war, propaganda, ways that more people got involved in the home front, from even things like knitting and war bonds and gardens. But this is a little bit of an overview. So during the war, about 1.3 million men enlisted and over 20,000 women did as well. And keep in mind that the entire U.S. population at this time was 103 million, which is, give or take 10% of the population joining the war, which does not include even the people that contributed the home front. Now, the military before the war was really small. The regular army had about 100,000 men. The National Guard had only been 115,000. So how do you go from like a few 100,000 to over 1 million in a short period of time? And the answer is really not easily. Most of the soldiers only trained for about 8 months before being shipped to war. So everything to learn about the weapons, different tactics, their uniforms, gas masks, whatever, they had about 8 months to do so. And because the army went from so small to so large so quickly, they didn't even have enough weapons at first. Sometimes they practiced literally with broomsticks to pretend they were rifles while they were going through their training. So imagine how confident you'd feel going to war after training with a broomstick. Now, women's, like I said, we'll go into more detail later, but they did serve not just as nurses, but as other important logistical roles in World War I. Another way to get the size of the army up was by the Selective Service Act. And we'll learn more about that as well, about how basically men between certain ages had to enlist, or this is the draft or conscription. African Americans trained and fought as well. However, they were in segregated units. So even if they came up in the north and went to desegregated schools and had employers of all various races, they were segregated in their units there. And about 350,000 served with American Expeditionary Force on the Western Front, and to much accolades. The French really appreciated their service. On the home front, you also have an issue with civil liberties. Now, of course, no one really I would say, would be in favor of spies. And you have the Espionage Act of 1917, and that was to prevent the support of U.S. enemies during wartime. But how really do you, where do you draw the line at who is being a spy and who is just using, various freedoms? You see that more extremely in the Sedition Act of 1918, which forbade the use of disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government, its flag, or its armed forces. So basically, if you said something bad about the president, let's say, you could be fined or arrested under the Sedition Act of 1918. There also was a lot of anti-immigrant hysteria. And we learned about this already, and this was nothing new. A lot of, anti-Italian and anti-Irish immigration, a lot of anti-Eastern European immigration, but now also of the immigrants from those countries. There were lots of German immigrants, so it's not like they were all being rounded up and beaten or harassed, but new immigrants, let's say, were being, tensions were arising, especially from Germany and Austria-Hungary. And German culture was suppressed. Lots of German immigrants in our history meant lots of German culture in our country. And they would do things to try to suppress that, which is how things like Frankfurters, which sounds very German, began to being called hot dogs. Some of you may know the town Long Valley I reside in. That used to be called German Valley into World War I, but you can't have it live in a town like German Valley during World War I, right? So now also, how do we finance the war? You have all these new demands for our economy, new demands for food and clothing, for guns, ammunition, where places to train, how to get troops there. How are you going to do it? Well, there's three main ways. One was by raising taxes. Two was by borrowing money from the public, which basically was in the form of war bonds, which you see an example there to the right. And also by printing money, which is something the government even did in the Civil War. Now, does that cause inflation? Usually, but it's sort of like a temporary holdover. There was a lot of increase of federal spending, right, as you need to pay for all these things. The labor force also rose because you needed more people in factories and all these sorts of things. And wages went up for some people, which became a problem then when troops returned home and people got accustomed to higher wages. Are they going to lose those jobs now? And what's going to happen? The farm labor force did decrease a little bit, but then it did go up more because while all the farms, let's say in France, were being, plowed over in warfare, they did rely on the American farms. So lots of farmers were taking out loans, basically to feed the war efforts, which then once the war ended, they couldn't always repay. Various ways people supported the war. There was the creation of the Committee on Public Education, which was created under an executive order. Remember, the president is Wilson here. The head of it was a man, George Creel, who was a big journalist before then. And they did not use the word propaganda. They, in fact, were against the use of the word propaganda, but that's basically what it was. And they used the newspapers, posters, radio, the telegraph back then, and even movies to get their point across, to get people to support the war. There was also something called 4-Minute Men. About 75,000 people were a part of this, where they went to social events and spoke about the war and why people should support it. And they spoke about it for 4 minutes because they believed that that was the extent of the human attention span, which is an interesting thing to discuss and think about. The CPE also extended its efforts overseas, especially to Latin America. Something that was also going on in the home front was the flu. It was international, and it's often considered the Spanish flu, but that's not like it didn't just happen in Spain. As many as 30 million people died throughout the world, and hundreds of millions more were infected. About 675,000 Americans died from the flu. And in its first year, life expectancy in America was so bad that it dropped 12 years because so many people died from the flu. It also had a devastating effect on the economy. Right? These are people that now can't fight war, they can't work at home. Wartime census in Europe underreported reports of illness and death, basically for morale, which may have only led to it spreading even more. They believe it started actually like in mines in the United States, but a soldier in Fort Riley, Kansas had it, and they believe it spread to many people. And they consider that ground zero. Lots of soldiers at Fort Riley had it, and then as they went abroad to war, they sort of spread it all over the world. So that's all for now. Like I said, we'll go into more detail with a lot of this stuff, but I wanted to give you a good background. All right, so have a good weekend, and I'll see you.